Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the 13th Dimension. My name is Jeremy York, and this right here is Scott Wilson. And I gotta say, he's lost a little bit of weight since last time I've seen him.
No. I'm here.
Oops.
What
Hi,
up?
how you doing?
I'm good, brother. He does kind of look like me, man.
Yeah, I know. He just doesn't know how to keep his mouth shut. You know that?
I got the same problem.
I know you do.
Hey, you know what? I'm fine with that. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's got one friend that talks all the time.
The thing is, I like this guy here better because he actually glows in the dark. Can you do that?
Well, it just depends. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not even going to ask. I do not want to know.
Yeah, it's probably better you don't.
Yeah. So, how was your Thanksgiving?
Dude, it was amazing. I got to spend some time with my friends, or my family, not so much my friends. Made a small commercial, got hit in the face with some whipped cream. Yeah, it was pretty good, dude.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that pie. How did that taste?
Uh, Not bad actually.
How did it smell?
Uh, like horrible whipped cream. It's horrible, dude. I was like, ugh.
That is outstanding. Well, we
Yeah,
got a good show tonight, don't we?
dude, we got an amazing. I'm excited, dude. Um,
We are actually moving from the paranormal to the
we
supernatural.
are, dude. I know it's so cool, dude. I'm super excited, man.
I am too. So what do you say we bring them on?
Yeah, let's bring him on.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome fellow Things member Tim Kohler.
Hey, what's up, guys?
How you doing,
What's up,
Tim?
Ollie?
I'm hanging in there, still full.
Oh, from Thanksgiving.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
Yeah, I
we,
think
we
we
go
all
all
got that
out,
problem.
man. We go all out.
Now, did you help cook?
Nope.
Good lord, dude. Wait, I didn't either. Never mind.
Is that better?
It don't help your face.
No, nothing helps my face.
I'm just kidding, brother. You know I got mad love for you.
Are we sure about that?
Oh, absolutely, man.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
So right now I'm sharing this out to all the different groups, so bear with me here. Tim, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody for those of the people out there in the audience who don't know who you are?
I'm Tim Kohler. I work with these guys. My wife Crystal and I do history and research for them. I focus mainly on the history part because I am a big time history buff. I've always loved history, especially different battles throughout history, wartime history, things like that. That's kind of my big thing. On the topic for tonight, though, chasing back through my family, you will find that I have family that dates all the way back into Romania around the time of Vlad the Impaler. So I have been told stories since I was a young kid about Vlad from my great grandmother, and for anybody that's family, that's on my dad's side, and what I have found out and stuff and different stories. I've been studying Vlad since I was about 12 years old. So feel like I know him pretty well.
Dude, I'm like super excited, to do this. I know you and I've talked many times on how much you and myself love stuff about history, man, especially this kind of history, dude. So, and yes, Holly, I do have color today.
And I have nuggies today.
I've got the Slim Jims.
So,
What do you
for
got?
those of you for those of you who have never investigated with me, I have my Sour Patch Kids, man.
Typical food for a day after Thanksgiving, isn't it?
If I had it my way,
I've got
I'd
a
have
whole.
turkey leg.
I was gonna say I've got a whole refrigerator full of leftovers from Thanksgiving, so
Wow.
we're gonna be eating that for the rest of the week.
Okay, I'll be over.
Come right on, man.
Clean your fridge out.
I'm just saying, my mama's dressing and my mama's coleslaw is in its own food group. Like that stuff is legendary.
Okay, well, since with this topic, we're moving into the supernatural, which is definitely a first for us on this show. And of course, what better thing to start off with than vampires?
Vampires have definitely played an important part in history. And you know, you have stories that date all the way back to ancient Greece, and that's where I'm going to start tonight, is in ancient Greece, and then kind of go through a brief history of the first recorded vampire in history, and a little bit. I'm not going to go into. The thing about vampires is there's a legend of some sort of vampiric creature on every continent outside of Australia. Or, I'm sorry, outside of Antarctica. Even Australia has this little frog man who sucks your blood, swallows your body whole, then spits you back out, and you're a little shorter and weaker each time he does this.
What's that supposed to be?
Until you turn into the little frog man. I'm not sure what the name of it is. It was too long for me to pronounce.
Okay.
And if I get the name of a city a little wrong, I am sorry. I am trying. Some of these are yay long when I write them down. So anything that's wider than my head when it's written is pretty impressive.
So if it's a very, very long name, it's got to be German. Because it seems like they got 20 letters for the word just to say hi.
Well, you have German, you have the Ottoman Empire, which we're going to be discussing. You've got Turkish. Yep. So yeah, some of them are a little long.
Okay. Well, let's start off with then just by the origin of vampirism.
So if you look back, and this is not what you would call recorded history. Sorry, my dog's going crazy. You have a story
on this show.
You have a story of a man named Ambrosia. And yes, while some of you may see that as a fruit salad that you may have enjoyed yesterday, Ambrosia goes back to the Oracle of Delphi. And here's a man who basically kind of defies the Oracle and defies Apollo by falling in love with the Oracle of Delphi's sister. The Oracle of Delphi was consulted by many people throughout the Greek world. The Spartans would not go to war unless they first consulted their Oracle of Delphi. So it was kind of a big thing to them. Well, Ambrosia kind of falls in love with the sister of the Oracle. And Apollo doesn't like that he wants to take off with his sister, take off with this woman who is one of the priestesses at the temple. So he curses him. He can't. He plans to meet his love at dawn and flee with her, but he curses him, and then from then on, sunlight burns his skin. So he has to go and hide in caves during the day. So he ends up trying to reverse the curse. And who does he go to? He goes to Hades. And he basically gives Hades his soul to try to reverse the curse. Well, the only way Hades will do this and give him his soul back is if he takes the bow of Artemis, Artemis's silver bow. Make a long story short, he ends up killing a bunch of swans. He writes letters to his love at night. He sends them off. Artemis gets mad at him, makes him thirst for blood. So he's drinking blood of these swans that he kills to write his loved one letters. They end up together because Artemis finds him, does give him a second chance. But they end up being cursed. And he ends up turning her into what he is by drinking her blood. Now, this is all subjective because it was found on a thing called the Articles of Delphi that was supposed to be a written record, but it's not exactly entirely accepted by the historic community. In fact, a lot of people believe these articles to be a hoax. The first recorded vampire in history, you're going to jump all the way up to 1732. And I'm sorry if I butcher this name, but the name of the man was Petra Plobluskisk. He was the first recorded vampire in history, and that was in Serbia. And he died. After he died, people claimed to see him, much like something paranormal almost. But they end up consoling the Orthodox Church. And this is also the first time in the Orthodox Church that vampirism is mentioned. 1732. He was dug up. They did this whole ritual of staking him down in. See, the whole driving the stake to the heart thing isn't necessarily true. It's they staked them to the coffins, nailed their coffin shut, and then placed the body back in.
So, what do you, if there are any, why do you think people would believe that Petra and all them, were like vampires? Were they going around biting people like they do in our modern day society?
Well, actually, it kind of feeds into my next part. And that is diseases. No, you're fine. That's a great leading question because basically there are a bunch of modern diseases nowadays that we know about that they didn't know about back then. And I believe a lot of them were responsible for bringing on the fear of vampirism. First and foremost were physical deformities. Mumps. Mumps is another one. You had knots that would swell on your head and that would cause you to be deformed, and that instantly meant that you had done something evil or that some kind of evil was on you. And
Right.
And in all truth and honesty, highly contagious diseases. Rabies was another one. Rabies, you go crazy, you start foaming at the mouth. Basically, anything that made you stand out and be different from the rest of the crowd. One of the biggest ones that has come to light in recent history, and there's actually a tombstone here in the U.S. that dates back to the 1700s, of a man named, his last name was Simons. But they found on his tombstone an inscription that says, even though consumption's vampirism took your life, you were loved. Now, that word consumption in modern day is known as tuberculosis.
Right.
And the reason tuberculosis is such a big candidate for why people had this fear of vampirism is the symptoms of tuberculosis itself. First off, your skin turns extremely pale. Vampires are pale, right?
Yep.
You have difficulty breathing air into your lungs. You have conjunctivitis, which is a reddening of the eyes, which also makes you very sensitive to sunlight. pale skin, and conjunctivitis. And then, of course, the most common thing is that you coughed up blood. And that meant, you know, that something was feeding off you or you were feeding off of something else. And that's the reason why you're coughing up blood. And the fact that it's so highly contagious. So I die, then my wife dies, my kids are dying. It must be because I'm coming back from the grave and getting them, you see. So that is why. There's a great word in the Romanian language called the strigoi. And strigoi has been used as the word for vampirism over there, which literally translates to one who rises from the grave, one who rises from the dead. In France, it's called strick. In Greece, I believe it's called strick. A lot of the word strick is used throughout the world as well. But the strigoi is kind of the origin of these words. And it comes from around the area of Serbia, Romania, things of that nature. And strigoi still to this day is a reference to vampirism over in Romania and places of that nature.
Wow.
So that's just one of those words that still today is used because, believe it or not, even now in modern history, with all the technological advances we have, people in the world still fear the vampire. There's no name in monster lore that strikes more fear into the hearts than the vampire. Kind of the vampire and werewolf tide, if you ask me.
Right.
And my personal thought on that is a vampire and a werewolf isn't just going to kill you. They're going to turn you into what they are.
Right.
And damn your soul to hell as well as theirs.
And what's sad is that there are a lot of bloodthirsty people out there today.
Yeah. Right.
There are. I've
Yeah.
actually been to a bar up in Toronto, which will remain nameless, but it's kind of an underground bar, and it's a vampire bar.
Oh no.
And people actually file their teeth down to points, and they'll drink each other's blood willingly, of course. I mean, nobody forcefully takes anything from you, but they do this. I did not partake in the events of that time.
I don't think I would either.
There's a lot of diseases out there that are transmitted through blood, so I highly don't recommend it.
No.
I'd be like, you got any Kool-Aid? Got any Kool-Aid?
Right.
Make it look
But I mean,
like blood.
at the end of the day, there is an entire culture around the word vampirism. And the word vampire literally means blood sucking.
And you know, there is a huge culture, and even in today's modern society, that, like you just said, there are people that want to be vampires. They want to live their life as vampires.
Yeah. I mean, you keep going throughout history, and there's all these different people, different places that, and there's a culture around it. You look at the movies. How many vampire movies have been made in just the last 40 or 50 years? It's unreal.
It is.
It's unreal. They
But
still
you
write
gotta
books
admit,
about
they are
it.
very good.
Oh, don't get me wrong. They still write books about it. I read when my children were little, I liked to read a book before they read it.
Yeah.
And my daughters were interested in reading the whole Twilight, Jacob and Edward thing. So I read the Twilight books. I read all of them. And I'm not gonna lie, Scott. It's cool because it's a different take on the traditional vampire. There's a lot of differences in Twilight that differ from what everybody thinks of vampire, you know. So it was cool in that sense. Granted, I'm not into the whole
Right.
Team Edward, Team Jacob thing is, you know. But
Team Alice.
okay, so I'm totally Team Edward, but but in all truth and honesty, I thought the stories were very interesting, and they were. They are. It's an interesting take.
And I think that's why the movies became so popular, because it was a different take on from what we've seen. You know, when Bela Lugosi played Dracula and Nosferatu, and even The Lost Boys, which is one of my favorites. It was a whole Twilight was just a whole different spin on it.
It really was.
My personal favorite was Salem's Lot.
That was a good one. Oh, and
Jeremy going OG on us.
Underworld with Kate Beckinsale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what was going on, but I ended up missing the last like 3 minutes with you guys. My computer kept freezing up on me. I was about having to reboot.
Uh-oh.
What,
Yeah.
you?
I know.
Amanda said she's Team Edward. That doesn't surprise me. At all, Amanda. That doesn't surprise me.
Also, speaking of vampires in modern history, though, we actually have evidence of a real life vampire ritual taking place in Romania as early as 2004. A man named Tom Petra got really sick, died suddenly, and all of a sudden his relatives started to get sick. His relatives disinterred his body. His brother-in-law took his heart out with a pitchfork. They burned his heart to ash, mixed the ash with water, and the family members drank it. And suddenly they all got better. They all claimed to have seen him walking down the streets even after he was dead, and that he was coming in the night to suck their blood and drink their blood. And this is in Romania in 2004.
This actually happened.
Yes, you can look it up. It's a real news story. It was covered worldwide in the news. This is a true story.
Wow.
That is crazy.
So the idea that vampires exist is still prevalent in many places throughout the world.
All right. It's definitely probably the most popular in all of monster culture, I guess you could say.
Yes.
Well, I'll tell you what, some people, they just really take it to the extreme. Filing their teeth to where they look like fangs, or even having fang implants.
Yes. Well, I mean,
it makes me wonder what the lure of it is. You know, I mean, is it a sensuality behind it? A sexual thing?
well, that's the thing with the start of the 1920s and Hollywood making movies. We've all seen the original Dracula with Bela Lugosi. It started to romanticize the legend of the vampire.
It did.
Historically, the legend of the vampire is horrifying.
Right.
But Hollywood
Especially
turned it
for
into
a time period.
Hollywood kind of romanticized the story behind it. And in that romanticism, they have made it into this whole sexual, sensual, sensation, pleasure-seeking culture. And it is true, as bad as I hate to admit it. But traditionally, the vampire was something that was feared beyond all else.
Yeah. And probably with Hollywood, in my opinion, the scariest vampire movie, I would have to say would be one of the very first ones, Nosferatu.
Yeah, Nosferatu is a really good movie. It really is.
It is a great movie, and that one does not romanticize the vampire at all.
No, it
He's
does.
not. He's not good looking. Really, though, even more so, the book Bram Stoker's Dracula really romanticized vampirism.
Yeah.
When you really break it down, that book is really where it started.
Okay, so when you're talking about where it starts, there is a question that I do want to ask you, and it'll probably go all the way back to, centuries before. But is there anything mentioned that says who or what the very first vampire actually was?
The first person in recorded history was Petra Poblesk, and it was believed that after he died, he was rising from the grave and drinking the blood from his own family members. A lot of the historical vampirism that you find was indeed family members, but there are some historical figures that were not. There was one, I don't remember the name of the guy, but they literally were going through and excavating this old city, and they found hundreds of graves inside the city wall. Well, they got to a part of the wall that had broken, and there was a man buried in the wall. A nail driven here at the apex of his throat, a nail driven just below his rib cage, and a nail driven through his ankles, nailing him into the coffin and burying him into the construction of an 8-foot thick city wall, because they believed him to be a vampire. And this was in the early 1800s when this man passed away, they believe. No one knows why they believed he was a vampire, but they believed something.
Yeah.
And this is close to an area, I can't remember where the area of the world is, but it's a place called the Island of the Vampires. There's a whole documentary about it. I highly suggest watching it. It's pretty cool.
I'll look into that. Okay. So with vampires, it's pretty much common knowledge that the idea of vampires originated or was in some part inspired by Vlad the Impaler. Can you tell us who Vlad the Impaler was?
Well, Vlad the Impaler was born in 1431, and bear with me, in a city called Zigazwashka. Yes, like I said, some of these names are really long. In Transylvania, which is now modern-day Romania. He was born to a single-story home, even though his father himself was a knight and a king and a prince. What you have to know about that area of the world is you have the Transylvania Saxons. Saxons, as we know, are Germanic. They had come down to Transylvania. They were wealthy businessmen, and that there were thousands of these people called boyars. And or not thousands, but hundreds. Boyars were all people who had some kind of claim to the throne. The Saxon businessmen would support this one, then switch and support this one, then switch and support that one. Whichever one wasn't going to tell them what to do and who to sell to.
Okay.
So in 1447, Vlad is 16 years old, and his father is murdered so that one of these other boyars can take control of the land. Vlad is forced to flee what was then Transylvania to a country called Wallachia, which is actually, they border each other. And Wallachia is mainly where Vlad chooses to set up base. It's really where Vlad is from. Below Wallachia, you got Transylvania to the north, Wallachia, and then the Ottoman Empire to the south, which is modern-day Turkey. So you have his father murdered, and he flees to the famous castle that everybody calls Castle Dracula nowadays, which is Bran Castle. Although I'll explain later, that's not really Vlad's castle. He grows up there for a little while, and then he comes back to claim his throne in 1456. And he starts by naming his capital city as Turgovishcha. Turgovishcha is where his grandfather had built the original castle. So Vlad starts rebuilding his palace there, and he builds a massive great hall. All the while, Vlad will not eat or drink anything unless someone else tastes it first.
Right.
The man is constantly looking over his shoulder because all it takes is one person to say, we don't want him in power anymore, and they're going to try to murder him. I mean, this at the time was the murder capital of the world. And I'll explain that in a little bit further detail in a minute. So they literally would just take these people and these princes, so-called princes, and just swap them in and out constantly. That way, the Transylvanian Saxon merchants kept power over the region. Vlad comes along, and all that starts to change. First off, Vlad's got a chip on his shoulder. You murdered my dad. So he's got a big chip on his shoulder. So he starts by I just lost my train of thought. Vlad starts off by inviting all the boyars to this new great hall he's built. And he looks at them all during this huge feast, and he says, tell me, in the last 50 years, how many rulers have we had? And all these men condemn themselves by saying, we can't tell you that. Nobody knows that. There's been hundreds of rulers in the last 50 years. In 50 years, there were so many rulers, not one person there knew the answer. So Vlad calls for his army to come in and surround the Great Hall, and they were all impaled. Now, impaling was a statement of the time. You didn't just insert a pole in somebody and throw them up there. There was an art form to it when Vlad was concerned. And typically when you impaled someone, you would shove it through their navel or through their chest, and you would put a sharpened stick, and you stuck them 15 feet, 20 feet up in the air, and you put the blunt into the pole in the ground. When it came to these boyars, that was not a good enough message for Vlad. Vlad greased the blunt into the poles, inserted it into their rectums, and stuck them 20 feet in the air to die slowly. It took days for that pole to work its way through your body.
Well, the boyars also.
Most people died of starvation or dehydration before their body actually died from injury.
The boyars also killed his brother, right? Because they tortured and killed him as well.
Yes. They had Vlad's family, anyone that had a claim back then had a target on them.
Yep.
That's the whole point of this, is that Vlad took out the competition. And he basically told the Transylvanian Saxons, if you're going to sell in my land, you're going to do what I tell you to do. And from the period of 1400 to 1500, he's the longest ruling person in Wallachia and Transylvania because he set the tone. He said, this is the way it is. Now, another thing you have to remember is Vlad's father was also Vlad. He was given the name by the Catholic Church, Vlad Dracul. Dracul means the Order of the Dragon.
Yep.
Vlad Dracula, it's actually pronounced in Romanian, it's actually pronounced Draculia, was the son of the dragon. So Vlad the Impaler is actually Vlad Dracula or Draculia, as he is the son of the man who was given the Order of the Dragon for defending the Christian faith. And that's really what Vlad did.
Either way, just his name alone is intimidating.
Yes, and when you talk about Vlad, you can't skip over the fact the modern city of Bucharest was founded by Vlad. He built a fort there, a fortification there. He built a massive fortress there, actually. And Vlad's real castle, the real Castle Dracula, is Ponary Castle, not Bran Castle. Bran Castle is where all the tourism goes now.
Right.
Ponary Castle lies a lot in ruins, but most of the original structure is still standing. And you have to talk about the way Vlad built these castles. Ponary was almost exclusively built by slave labor, but there was evidence of master masonry work there. Castle Ponary was a self-sufficient castle. It had grounds inside for growing, and it encompassed the entire top of a mountain. It had the river below it, but the mastery part of Vlad is the roofs would actually take all the rainwater that fell on the roof and put it into a cistern inside the castle. So if his castle was surrounded, they still had drinking water. They still had food to eat. There was no capturing him in that castle. Not to mention that the castle is surrounded on three sides by basically a 1,500-foot drop. It is almost straight up. It's at a slight incline, but almost straight up to get to that castle. To walk into that castle, you have to go up 1,480 steps, carved out of the side of the hill, and the widest spot you can fit two grown men. So if you're going to come at me with numbers, you're going to come at me from one way in, one way out, and I'm going to concentrate all my force on that area. Good luck.
So he was a very, very smart man back then.
Yes, he actually expanded the top of the mountain for the castle. And he built his castles with a construction that was called the Byzantine style of construction, or Byzantine style of construction, whichever way you want to say it, where you build an inner wall, an outer wall, and then you filled the interior of the wall with rubble. So this allowed the castle to be not only strong and thick, but it didn't take a long time to build it. You could throw a castle wall up much faster this way than you could building it any other way. It's kind of like modern walls now. We have an outer wall, an inner wall, and in between you have insulation. Vlad just made his insulation as rocks. So you have rubble inside the wall. Castle Ponary is unique because it's in an earthquake zone. And when you look at the castle, it actually gives a two-tone appearance. The castle is river stone at the bottom, and then about halfway up, it becomes brick. And then he also used a special thing that helped it still survive after 600 years. And that special thing is lime mortar. Lime mortar is about the consistency of real thick whipped cream. And when you use lime for mortar, it won't set up completely. So if you use regular concrete is going to harden completely. Lime actually gives flexibility. So when you're in an earthquake zone and your walls are kind of flexible, they stay standing and not tumble to the ground. The man was a genius when it came to construction. And if you were a master mason working for Prince Vlad, your life depended on your work. And here's why I'm going to say that. The way they built archways back then is they put wood up and then built the brick inside of a wood frame. When they would take the wood frame off the archway, the master mason had to stand beneath it. So if it's ever going to fail, it's going to fail on him. He had to stand underneath the archway as they removed the framework. So if he screwed up, he's dead. I think we're froze. Are we froze? Or is just Jeremy froze?
Jeremy might be froze.
I think Jeremy might be froze.
But dude, that would make sense. I mean, if you're going to do something like that, man, you know, and you want the best guy to do it, prove your worth. Stand underneath that.
And Vlad's castle walls were 9 to 10 feet thick in most places.
Right.
So by building those Byzantine-style walls, you have a thinner outer wall, thinner inner wall, and then filling it in with rubble. It made it like a solid structure. And it could be done quick, it could be done easy and fast with the materials surrounding you. He almost always used locally sourced materials.
And that's good.
Yes. When you're talking about Vlad too, you have to talk about the way he. There he is.
Hello.
Are you back, man?
So when you're talking about Vlad, you also have to talk about his military prowess. The man was a military genius. He didn't just go out and fight you on the battlefield. He demoralized your troops. When Vlad went out, Vlad set out to invade the Ottoman Empire. As he's marching forward, everything's fine. But eventually, Vlad's going to run out of men and troops, so he's got to start turning around and heading back to Wallachia. Well, the prince of the Ottoman Empire, one of the princes of the Ottoman Empire at the time, was Mehmed. And Mehmed, or Mehmed, whatever you want to call him, was following Vlad back to Wallachia. So, you know, it's a push and pull thing. So Vlad pushed in, Mehmed's following him back. Well, Vlad knows the Turkish army. He knows their tactics. So, and of course, by stating this, I have to bring up the fact that the Ottoman Empire was the reigning Islamic empire of the day.
Welcome back, Jeremy.
Vlad's country was Orthodox Christian. So you have these two religious forces at bay too. So Vlad invades into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is coming back. Vlad, of course, first thing he does is take prisoners. Then, knowing the Turkish army, he knows that they get all of their resources to feed and drink, to eat and drink from, while their armies are marching from the lands they're going to. So as Vlad comes back, he burns the fields. He burns the fields of his own people. He doesn't care. He gives them nothing to eat. He poisons the wells. So every time there's a place to drink, Vlad poisons it.
Yep.
So now this army is marching hundreds of miles with nothing to eat, nothing to drink. He pays men that are sick and dying to infiltrate Mehmed's army to spread disease.
Yep.
Then he gets back to Bucharest Fortress. He knows he's going to be overtaken there if he stays. He stays just long enough to impale 20,000 people, puts them up in the air, leaves them sit there, and waits for the Ottoman Empire to come. Mehmed was so disgusted and so horrified by what he found when he got there, he himself took his personal people that came with him and marched back into the Ottoman Empire. He would no longer pursue Vlad. He left his army there to pursue him, but he himself was so horrified by what he found in Bucharest, he left the country and stayed out.
Wow.
Imagine being hungry, being thirsty, and you walk up and find 20,000 of your own men up on poles, 20 feet in the air, screaming, let me down, let me down, let me down, help me, help me, help me. And there's nothing you can do to save them.
I don't know if they'd be screaming with the pole going through their mouth and their necks, but it'd be a scary sight, though, man. Woo!
It would be.
Oh, you're trying to show my pun shirt. She's trying to show my pun shirt.
You talk about how do you pronounce it? Wallachia. For people who don't know, that is in today's society, that is Romania.
Romania actually encompassed Wallachia and what was Transylvania. Technically, they were two separate things.
Right.
Poneri also gave Vlad an excellent point to look out over those Transylvania Saxons because he built it basically right on the border as high as he could. So, I mean, this guy built castles. He built fortresses. He improved on the castles he had. He improved Bran Castle. He made it bigger. He expanded it. He made turret towers that had the boiling oil. When you talk about Vlad, you're talking about somebody who is boiled, disemboweled, beheaded, and impaled his way into the history books.
That is a fact, man.
Yes. I mean, the guy was.
Yeah. But until tonight, I also never realized how much of a genius he really was. And being able to create a castle that can withstand an earthquake.
Yeah.
I mean, with that kind of material, why don't they use that on buildings in California?
Well, because we build things completely different now. You're not building a Byzantine-style wall that's going to have rubble inside that's going to move with the wall. To build it that way, you have to build the entire wall that way. So any part of the structure that is weaker than another is going to cause a collapse. So you have to think of how buildings are built now versus then. And we have more modern ways now. We have, different materials that we can use between block of stone to create a more sound structure.
Wow.
Believe it or not, they do make earthquake withstanding buildings.
I do find that hard to believe. So when you were talking about, I don't know if you brought this up during the time that I had to reboot my computer, but when you were talking about all these, 20,000 people who were impaled, would that have been the inspiration for the painting or the artwork, whatever it is called, Forest of the Impaled?
Yes, actually, it was. The Forest of the Impaled is something that kind of ties Vlad to Draculaism, or Vlad to vampirism, even though there is no record of Vlad ever being cannibalistic in nature at all.
Okay.
Around the time Vlad lived in the Middle Ages, cannibalistic was highly frowned upon. He would have lost the total respect of his people if he had engaged in cannibalism. What the Forest of the Impaled was basically a wood cutting. There were several of them that were made by those Transylvania Saxon merchants and placed throughout the country. And people would pay money to come and see them. And it was propaganda. We don't like this guy. We don't want this guy. So we're going to make him look like the devil himself. Which will play into a story a little bit later on as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the Forest of the Impaled is a picture of Vlad eating dinner amongst a field of impaled bodies. And what you have to understand is impaling someone is not a quick, easy process. It takes time. So when all these people are being impaled, Vlad himself isn't doing the sticking, He's got people that are going to do that for him. He gets hungry. He wants to take his meal. He's going to sit there and eat. He's got nowhere else to go. He's got to sit down. He's got to eat. So he's sitting there eating his dinner amidst a field of utter chaos. Yeah, I believe we have a picture of it. That is the picture of Vlad. You can see people being beheaded.
Yep.
People up on the poles, impaled. And Vlad is sitting there coolly and calmly eating his dinner with his hands up going, I'm not bothered by this. But this photo actually encouraged a change in Romania of the word Dracula and Dracul to mean devil instead of dragon, which I'll get into a little bit more later as well.
You know,
But after seeing that picture, I got to tell you, I need a snack break.
Yeah, seeing that, I'm hungry as I'll get out. I say, on the count of three, gentlemen, let me get some sauce here. On the count of three, 1, 2, 3, eat.
and look, mine's got red in it.
Perfect.
You know,
the snack
if
break.
you want to intimidate your enemy, anybody that's going to try and come up and attack your castle, let's just throw some bodies up there. Let's impale them. This is what you're going to get if you come to attack me.
Exactly. And Vlad was so good there were even instances where he deserted and left the castle, and the army didn't even attack it. Which I'll tell some stories about that later on too. Some old family stories that I know. But Vlad goes on to rule in 1456. He has to leave for a short period and come back and leave and come back. He actually resorted to a style of warfare known today as guerrilla warfare. Vlad was going out with small groups instead of whole armies and attacking here and disappearing, attacking there and disappearing, attacking here and disappearing. And that was completely new to the Ottoman Empire's style of fighting.
Right.
They had no clue how to deal with this. And by doing that guerrilla tactic warfare, Vlad was eventually able to get the Turks out of his country, keep them out. He almost certainly died in battle. We know that he died in 1476. So he ruled Wallachia for 20 years. We know he died in 1476 and that he almost certainly died in battle. Almost all the main scholars believe that he died somehow in battle. During Vlad's lifetime, when you were leading men out to war, you didn't sit back and send your men in for you. You were on the front line. You led the charge. If you didn't, you were nobody. Your men would instantly have no respect for you.
Basically, practice what you preach.
Yeah,
Right.
if you're going to ask me to die for you while you sit back, nah, I ain't having that. You got to get out there and fight right side by side with me. And that was the time and place where Vlad lived. That was the style of fighting. So Vlad almost certainly died in battle in 1470. I keep wanting to say 1776. 1476.
Right. They believed he was him and some soldiers were ambushed by the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
Killed.
And he is supposedly buried, and I'm going to butcher this word. I want to say it's pronounced Snagov Monastery. It's Snagov. He is believed to be buried there. It's actually on an island in a lake. But the original story was that Vlad was buried right in front of the altar. And there is a square tomb in front of the altar. But in recent years, they have found out that there is no body there. There are hundreds of bodies littering the grounds there. But Vlad is not there. Vlad was also believed to have been beheaded. and his head taken back to the Ottoman Empire to prove he was dead. They were so terrified of Vlad, they wouldn't accept his death until they proved it. I mean, one of the stories that goes along with Vlad is when he was trying to rally people throughout Christendom to come to his aid and fight off these horrible Ottomans, that to show his strength and power, he actually sent 24,000 noses of his victims to another ruler to say, hey, come and help me. Here's a show of my strength, but I need you to help. 24,000 noses cut from his own victims. The guy was sick and twisted, but that's why we love him.
I'd be like, you know what? I'm good, man. No.
Vlad was, like I said, he passed away sometime in 1476. We're all pretty sure of that. We don't know where he's buried to this day. His grave is completely unknown to the world. Probably will be for all the time. Vlad had no living descendants. His own wife, while in Paneri Castle, was so afraid that the Ottoman Empire was going to kill them that she jumped to her death in the river. That part of the story is true. That river to this day is still called locally the River of Princesses, the River of the Princess. So, I mean, there was many sad events in Vlad's time, but Vlad brought some of them on himself. It said that he ripped a baby from his mistress, like out of her while the baby was still growing. He wasn't what you would call a nice man, but on the same hand, Vlad had to be ruthless. What most people don't get about Vlad is if he wasn't that ruthless, if he wasn't that courageous and that bold, he would have never have survived. Nope. His survival was kill or be killed. That was the situation that life gave him, and that was how he had to live.
And you know, looking at it, you know, his dad and his brother were murdered. So you got to get that mentality. Like, if I don't become this ruthless thing, I'm going to get it next. Yeah. You know, he had to make people fear him.
Yes.
So that took it to the extreme.
Yes. And that is the true story of Vlad the Impaler.
Wow. Okay, so when you're talking about Vlad, his legacy is tied directly into Count Dracula, vampires. How did that happen?
Well, basically it happened because of Bram Stoker's book, Dracula. Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897. And it was an instant bestseller. It had everything: murder, romance, monsters. You know, this guy who can change into a bat and change into rats. And if you ever read the book, it's actually brilliantly written. It's one of my favorite books of all because it's written from, this chapter is an article from a newspaper. This chapter is someone's diary entry. This chapter is another person's diary entry. And you see all these points slowly come together.
Are there any pictures?
No, I'm sorry, Scott. It's not super long though. I think you could handle it. It's
for you, Scotty.
I believe it's below 300 pages. You should be able to manage it.
Man, nice. I'll take that.
It's not The Stand or It. Or The Count of Monte Cristo.
Okay, so Bram Stoker wrote this. Why did he base it off of Vlad?
Well, the main reason why he based it off of Vlad was Vlad's cruel nature. Vlad was this person who just seemed larger than life, didn't care about anything other than his own survival and his people and defending the Christian faith. But Bram Stoker kind of wrote it as Vlad was betrayed and turned his back against the Christian faith. There's also that word Dracula and Dracul. In ancient Romanian in the time of Vlad, that word Dracul meant dragon.
Yep.
It was a title given to a knight who was defending Christendom. In modern Romanian, which when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, that's when he would have studied modern Romanian to hear the story. In modern Romanian, that word means devil. Devil and son of the devil.
Yeah.
So when he's trying to pick this person, who can I pick as a historical figure and make him into this monster? Vlad fit the part. Vlad was that monster. Vlad was that bloodthirsty tyrant who would never give up his lands. And even the land itself makes its way into Dracula, in the belief that he had to be packed into crates of earth from his homeland to travel across the ocean. That's because of an old belief that vampires cannot cross salt water. So he had to be packed in crates of earth and return to his coffin every day during the daylight.
Right.
And Bram Stoker wrote about this guy as if he were the devil himself or the son of the devil himself. So it's a simple miscommunication, a simple misinterpretation of a word. But on the same hand, Vlad kind of, in a way, kind of made his fate that because of just how cruel and how mean he was as a living person. So in a way, Vlad's responsible, but for the most part, it was Bram Stoker who kind of associated Vlad with vampirism. And ever since then, the story that Bram Stoker wrote was so good, people believe it to this day. People still believe that Vlad was this vampire.
Right.
Not so much in Romania.
Well,
In Romania,
the paintings of Vlad the Impaler,
well,
he would actually kind of look like a vampire.
yes, but historically, there's no evidence that Vlad ever drank blood or ate human flesh. That was all the propaganda. And we've all seen what wartime propaganda, how powerful an influence that can have over people. That's why these Transylvanian Saxons were trying their best to get Vlad out of there, because Vlad wasn't going to just let them have their way. You're going to do what I say, when I say, and how I say to do it, or I'm going to put you on a pole and stick you 20 feet in the air. So Vlad was this guy who took control of a situation that had not been controlled. He was this guy who made sure nobody was going to come after him and take what was his. Because if you did, you were going to face his wrath. And he lived at a time when the Ottoman Empire was wanting to expand western into Europe. And the only thing standing in his way was this little country of Wallachia. A bunch of tribal people, they're hill tribe people, farmers, until he met Prince Vlad. And that stopped him for 20 years from getting a full invasion into Europe. So Vlad was this guy, and today in Romania, in modern Romania, Vlad the Impaler is known as a freedom fighter, a defender of the faith, someone who was a hero to his country. He's a national hero.
Today he's still considered a national hero.
Thousands and thousands and thousands of people flock to the, Snagov monastery every year to try to see where Vlad is buried.
Wow. That would be interesting.
It's one of the people still to this day go to Bram Castle and try to experience a little bit of that. How many of us have said our dream location to go and investigate would be Castle Dracula?
Yeah,
I
and now
mean-
we are learning that Dracula's castle isn't actually the castle.
Well, the reason they call it the castle is because it was just built with mastery. Poneri Castle is almost it's almost the perfect defensible castle. He basically built an eagle's nest up above everything. I mean, he could see miles and miles out in front of him. He summited a mountain and put a castle on it.
That's,
So, I mean, this guy was a genius
yeah.
when it came to watching his own back.
Hey, Justin Clifford wanted to know if you had the choice, would you be a human being haunted by a vampire or the vampire hunting the human? Dude, I would have to be the vampire. I'm just saying, man.
And here's my thing. I think I would be the human, and I'll explain why. Because in the lore of that vampire is still destructible. And in the lore of vampirism, your soul is condemned. And I'd rather not have my soul condemned.
But
What about you?
have more fun.
I knew he was going to say that.
I would be the one to say something like that.
But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you have folklore, you have a real human being, and you have one person out there who tied the two together. And it made that person infamous throughout history. And he kind of gets a bad rap, in my opinion. In my opinion, he did what he had to do to survive.
Yeah.
Scott, myself, anybody who's kind of done anything former military or anything like that is going to know when you're put in that survival situation, you do what you got to do to survive. And that's what he did. If he had to be the most sick, twisted person in history, so be it.
And that around the same time when the Ottoman Empire was expanding, so they wanted to expand their land. I mean, dude,
Yes.
if you don't get your land taken, you're going to have to you have to stand up to who's ever wanting to take it. I mean, history has proved that.
And Wallachia was the key to moving into Europe. For 20 years, the man kept the Ottoman Empire out of Europe.
I'd say that's pretty good.
It is. That's a hell of a feat, really.
Yes.
Because nowadays, it's hard to keep somebody out of somewhere even for a few months, let alone 20 years.
Right.
And he employed every low down, dirty trick he could employ to stop them. But he stopped them. And that's the key.
Like you said, propaganda. When you look at the psychological feature of all of it, like I said, if you're the Ottoman Empire and you're going there to try and take it over and you see 20,000 guys up in the air, 20 feet in the air, impaled, you might have second thoughts about maybe we should go somewhere else.
He didn't just do impalings. Impaling was just his preferred method.
Right.
Like I said, that guy boiled, beheaded, disemboweled, disfigured, and impaled his way into the history books.
Yeah, that's
He employed every means of torture he had ever heard of.
And
One of my favorite stories about Vlad is they send what would you call it? An emissary. The Ottoman Empire sends a messenger to Vlad,
Right.
and they want Vlad to pay tribute. And Vlad says, "Why would I pay tribute to you when you come to me and come into my castle and insult me?" And they say, "Well, how do we insult you?" And it's like, "You did not remove your turbans." And the messenger says, "We never remove our turbans." So Vlad ordered them to never remove their turbans because he had them nailed to their heads. So, I mean, the guy was sadistic. You're not going to take your turban off in front of me? Fine. We're going to nail it to your head so you can never take it off.
Do you think that somebody like Vlad would? Can you imagine if we had somebody in the world today that was anywhere close to what Vlad was back then?
Arguably, we have. We've had people that have defended their countries, defended their beliefs, and we've had the bad guy too.
Yep.
And you have to remember, the line between good and bad is literally which side of the fence you're standing on.
No.
If I was born in the Ottoman Empire or in modern day Turkey or, one of those countries that the Ottoman Empire encompassed, Vlad might be the bad guy. So you have a thin line between good and bad. And we've had people in modern history who have tried their best to defend their country, and that's what Vlad did. It wasn't that he was power hungry. It wasn't that he was bound and determined to put his thumb down on people. It was that it was rightfully his to rule. It was his duty, and he was going to protect it at all cost.
Right.
And that's the true story of Vlad. When you look at him historically now, from his own country people, they still tell stories about Prince Vlad today and his acts of greatness and his acts of kindness and his acts of cruelty. The things that made him great are the reasons why. I mean, it's been 520, we are what?
40 years.
Yeah, 544 years after his death, we're still sitting here talking about him.
And we're still making movies about him and writing books about him.
Exactly. I kind of feel sorry for the guy for his tie-in with vampirism, but when it comes to a monster who could encompass all that, Vlad fit that bill perfectly.
Absolutely.
When you're looking for that guy who's bloodthirsty and determined and bound, and that was Vlad. So in a way, like I said, he kind of mixed his own destiny with Bram Stoker, but Bram Stoker took a lot of creative licensing in telling the story of Prince Vlad.
And also misinterpreted.
Yes. Yeah. Simply, like I said, when a word's not used in a language or takes on a different meaning, and it's, over 200 years, 300 years, it was actually over 400 years before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. There was nobody around for at least 100 years that had heard Dracula mean son of the dragon. It meant son of the devil. So that's not Bram Stoker's fault necessarily for misinterpreting that word, but nobody remembered that it meant dragon before devil. Or if they did, Remember, they just didn't tell him that. Could be one explanation. Another explanation was he just didn't care what it meant, other than devil. I mean, I found this guy. This guy's perfect for my bad guy. I'm writing him in, you know?
So
I'm not going to pretend to know what Bram Stoker was thinking at the time.
well, he got to have some sort of a twisted mind to make up a story like that to begin with.
Well,
But if you think about it, if he had understood and cared about what a word actually meant, what the original true origin, it's very possible that Dracula may have had a completely different name in the book.
yeah. And he doesn't. His name is Vlad Dracula. He is a prince. He is a count. He is all these different things in the book. And that he, you know, by making that leap, Bram Stoker took a real person and turned him into a total monster.
Turned him into a legend.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in all truth and honesty, it did. It keeps us talking about Vlad. But when you hear the true story of Vlad, you realize he was already a legend before Bram Stoker ever wrote Dracula.
Right.
But it does make you wonder, had Bram Stoker not written Dracula, would we actually, in fact, be talking about Vlad today? My guess, for me, I would say no.
Yeah.
I would think that we would be, but probably not anywhere near to the extent of what we are.
And I would have to say, in Romania, in Vlad's land, Vlad would still be talked about today. There are statues of him there.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, Vlad would still be talked about. Like I said, my great-grandmother, you know, died in 1999. She told me stories when I was 12 years old. Those stories today still resonate with me because I can't turn on a documentary and hear that story.
Right.
So those stories to me are what make Vlad so special. The fact that I had family that came from that area. I had people, my people came, part of my people came from that area and that land. And those people that those people that were family to me were still telling those stories years ago. So that's what endears Vlad to me.
And that is amazing that, like you said, people are still talking about his legacy and telling stories, 440 years later or whatever. That's amazing.
Right. And I mean, some of the stories I were told, my favorite story is the story of the horseshoes. So Vlad, this is during Vlad's retreat and Vlad's, when he was doing his guerrilla warfare and things like that. When Vlad was retreating from the Ottoman Empire, one of the local villages there actually shoed all of Vlad's horses backwards. So they took all the horseshoes off the horse and nailed them on backwards. Well, as Vlad rode off in the middle of the night and the Turkish scouts came and surrounded in the morning, and here comes the army, they go back and report to the army, oh, he didn't run away, he brought more people in. He brought in reinforcements, and they actually left the castle alone. They did not invade the castle because they were afraid that he brought more people in, and they had flipped the horseshoes around. He wasn't even there. The castle was sitting completely empty, and they actually just went around it and avoided it completely because they didn't want to fight the force that Vlad had brought in.
Dude, that was awesome, man.
See, that's why I said the man was so smart. He could make you not even invade an empty castle and take his land. He could make you not take his land when he wasn't even there. And it's little things like that, little stories I've heard stories of Vlad going through the streets and there not being enough to eat, and him actually taking food from his castle and giving it to his people to make sure that those who had none to eat had something to eat. Vlad was that kind of a ruler, and I believe. I believe that the reason he is near and dear to the people today is because of how he ruled those people then. And while he was vicious, while he was sadistic, while he was mean, he also had compassion for his people. You can't be a crusader for Christendom and not follow those practices.
Wow. I'm kind of lost here.
Yeah, we went through it kind of quick.
I'm just absorbing all of this because some of this stuff I had heard before, and a lot of it I hadn't. And it's just so much about this that really completely changes how you look at not only Vlad, but looking at Dracula.
Well, there's another story about Vlad too that I really love. It's when he really sticks it to the Transylvanian Saxons. And it's hard for me to say that because look at my last name. It's obviously German. So those Saxons could have been family too. but because this is just one part, you know. But another one of those stories that I know, and it is in some of was the 1459 raid of Brasov. And Vlad knows that Brasov is a fortified city. It's got 8-foot thick walls that are still standing in parts of the city today. It's got turrets. It's got military. It's got these humongous barrack complexes, one of which belonged to the Weavers Guild of the time, still stands today, as it did then. And when Vlad goes to sack Brasov, he attacks at night. He takes everybody in the suburbs and then impales them on the hill, which to this day is called Hanging Hill, right outside of Brasov for all of them to see. And Brasov that was the big city of the Transylvanian Saxon Transylvanian time. This is just 3 years after he took control. He goes in there, he busts the place up at night, and that's why the woodcut of the Forest the Impaled was made. That's why it was circulated, because he showed them, you're going to do what I tell you to do, or you're going to end up here. And it terrified him. He struck fear into the hearts of millions of people in his time. And then Bram Stoker comes along, sees that fear, and writes a story that makes him strike fear into the hearts for all those of us who follow. And that's what I love about the story of Vlad.
And so many people love the story of Dracula. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we were talking earlier, people want to be a vampire. They find the sensuality behind it. And I think that's what Bram Stoker brought to it, was the sensual and all that, being Dracula.
Bram Stoker romanticized the story by bringing in the story of his wife committing suicide.
Right.
Bram Stoker romanticized the story as he finds this woman, Mina, who's living 400 years after his death, that looks just like his wife. And he pursues her to make her his love again. He feels like this is the reincarnation of my beautiful wife before. And that's where Bram Stoker romanticized the story of Vlad. That's where he made vampires sexy.
Right.
If you want to call it that back then.
Well, in 1897, when he wrote the book, people were starved for romance. Look at the story of Jack the Ripper. Bram Stoker was English. It's written. Bram Stoker's Dracula takes place in England and Romania, not necessarily America. So Bram Stoker was English, and just 9 years before he writes Bram Stoker's Dracula, you have Jack the Ripper terrorizing the streets of England. So, and people love a good story.
That they
People want that good story. People want that romanticism in the story. You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So that whole romanticism, that whole bit about it being a love story resonates with people today still. We're all still looking for that in our lives, in our every day. And even now, more so than ever, that we can't get out and communicate face to face with everything that's going on in the world today. It makes us seek intimacy more and more and more.
Yes, it does.
It does. You know, what better way than become a vampire and go get it?
I'm not saying it's for everybody. It's certainly not for me, but for some people, hey, you got to be you.
It's just, like I said, it's the story of Lad and how it just connects with everything. It's crazy, man. You know.
Yes.
Vlad, if you look at it from one perspective, Vlad was probably the most evil man who had ever lived.
Yeah, and I was trying to think earlier too about other diseases of the time that could be associated with vampirism. I mean, you have the plagues and all that, but that was kind of before everything kind of came around to vampirism. And I got to thinking about it, parasites. In all truth and honesty, a vampire is a parasite. Mm-hmm. It feeds off the blood of the living. He's a tick. So
somebody in the chat had mentioned mosquitoes are vampires, which, you know,
in all truth and honesty, the original word vampire means blood sucking. So if someone died from an infestation of parasites, I mean, in about every story of vampirism that you see, the person was in some form a social outcast, if you will. They were either social outcasts or their entire household got sick. So I strongly believe that a tie-in with infectious diseases. Seriously. Also, another great instance with vampirism, and I just remembered this. They would dig these corpses up. And what do they find? They find these bodies who aren't quite decayed yet. It's maybe, a month after they've been buried. Their bellies are swollen. Their hair has grown. Their nails have grown. Their teeth look larger. And there's blood coming out of their mouth. Now, let's explore that a little bit. Your hair and skin, or your hair and nails, continue to grow after you die, which was unbeknownst to them at the time. But that's because the dead skin cells in your body still feeding them. Your lips pull back away from the teeth because the first thing your body does in the process of decay is it dehydrates. And then the gases inside your stomach, the bacteria in there cause gases because the bacteria is still trying to feed, and it causes gases to build up inside your stomach and bloat your stomach. This also causes blood to be forced out through any cavity it can find, typically the mouth first. So as they dig up this corpse to find out why people are saying that they're coming back to haunt them, they're finding these bodies laying in the ground with bloated bellies, big old full bellies, blood coming out of their mouth, their teeth showing, their nails longer, their hair longer. Oh my God, they must be a vampire. So the first thing we need to do is chop off their head, drive a stake through their heart, nail them down in the coffin, make sure they can't rise up from the dead, burn them. There's 1,000 different rituals for vampirism. All of them a little different. All of them. There was one suspected person in America of being a vampire, and this goes all the way back to, like the witch trial eras, of America, before America was actually a country. And the person, they buried him. He was dug up and reburied. Uh-oh, where's Scotty going?
I'll be back.
Scotty's scaring me. The reason they dug him up and reburied him, they actually took his femurs, crossed them across his chest in the form of a crucifix, turned his skull around backwards, because they thought, this was the right ritual to do. You had such an alarming death rate during the times of the 1700s through 1800s, the 18th, 19th century. You had such a fast rate of death, such a fast rate of decay. You need to blame it on something. Not to mention the fact that a lot of places, people were buried in shallow graves. There was no 6-foot wall back then. They were buried in crudely constructed wood boxes, if anything at all. So bones would start to come back up out of the ground with erosion, and as the ground started to settle down, it would push the bone up. Lighter bones, things of that nature. You find it all over Europe in different spots where the bones have actually come through the ground in the cemeteries. And this caused the belief of rising from the dead. And let's face it, they didn't really have zombie stories back then. They had vampires. So these people that they believed were rising from the dead, and they're digging up a fresh corpse and finding its belly bloated and blood coming out of its mouth, they must be feasting off the living. That's why their bellies are full and there's blood coming out.
Yeah.
If you really think about it, the first,
Okay, one at a time, guys. One at a time.
if you really think about it, the vampire could be like, could be almost like a zombie type story. I mean, vampires, they're the undead. They feed on people. The only real true difference is that zombies don't turn into a bat.
And that, what is funny is you look at different cultures from all over the world and their vampire stories. One of them is the story of just a head that flies around, and the entrails leave the body and fly around with the head as it goes through and sucks blood from creatures. One of them is a woman that detaches the top half of her body from the bottom half of her body and flies around and sucks the blood of people. And if you can destroy the bottom half of her body while her body's cut in half, then you kill the vampire. All these different stories, I believe, came into play when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. Really, it's the first time you hear vampires turning into beasts.
Right.
Other than some of these local legends. I mean, the man really did his homework on it. Because the story of a vampire turning into a beast really comes from the South American regions, from different tribes in South America. So Bram Stoker really did his homework on the vampire before he came out with his book. He really made it seem like This guy was the devil himself. This guy was immortal. He was invincible. He had superhuman strength. He could transform into different animals. He could appear as smoke and go through a keyhole. He was that guy.
Right.
That guy that could get you no matter what you did. So I mean, there and not only that, but Bram Stoker's Dracula was the first time that introduced the vampire being afraid of the crucifix. It's all part of that romanticism. It's all part of that. How do we make this story not so much believable as we make it so unbelievable it's believable?
And it would make sense making with that story being the introduction of the vampire being afraid of the crucifix, because with that translation of Dracula being the devil, and so you got the devil versus the cross, who wins out? Naturally, you would think that the devil is afraid of the cross and everything it represents.
And Nick was just commenting on here about the Eastern European traditions of the vampire with the appearance as in humans. And I actually have a really cool thought about that. We as paranormal investigators, we know when we go out to a location that we're all looking for that apparition, that ghost.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often wondered if vampirism and original ghost hunting went kind of hand in hand. If they saw the apparition of someone that they saw in life or that they knew in life and thought it was a vampire, so they dug up and desecrated the grave fear that they saw this ghost. So that's often been a slight theory of mine.
I never thought of it that way.
You know me, I'm always thinking differently than most people.
Yeah, we definitely know there, Tim.
But I
No,
thought I
Nick
just
did
thought
make
it was an interesting theory.
point.
Go
It
ahead,
is.
Scott.
That's what I was doing. I was reading Nick's comment, and he made a great point.
Yeah. In other parts around the world, including the U.S., vampires are more demonic than monsters. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's true. Like I said, in Australia, it's a little bitty frogman. In Brazil, you have with bat-like wings, and you have almost a shape-shifting vampire down there. You have there's lots of different stories from every continent on the face of the planet, outside of Antarctica. That's because nobody lives there. Outside of some researchers for a couple months out of the year.
I was going to say, wait a minute, there are some down there. Okay, so with all the knowledge that you do have based on vampires, which movie, out of however many hundreds there are, which movie would you think got it closest to being right?
Oh, that it's tough because my personal belief on vampirism is that people didn't understand what was actually killing people, and that translated into them mistaken. I personally believe vampirism is a case of mistaken identity. But you know me, I'm a realist. So vampirism to me is kind of a joke. If you're asking me what vampire movies do I love Dracula Untold. That movie was really cool. And I love And the reason I love that movie is because it portrays the sense of a man who would do anything, even give his own soul for the sake of his people. And I really like Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie with Gary Oldman.
Yes.
The way it depicts and really brings the pages of the book to life. So I mean, those two movies are probably my favorite. I've always liked the story of Nosferatu because it's a different take on the vampire than what the more modern Count Dracula is, you know.
Yeah.
So, and who can forget Bela Lugosi? You know, Bela played that role so well with the eyes, you know, and the voice.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Are there?
But
I
accurately,
myself, but are there any movies out there that are based on Vlad?
well, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Dracula Untold, they're both based on Vlad loosely, but they're more based on the vampire side than there are on the actual man himself. There are hundreds of documentaries.
Getting at the actual man himself, how he lived his life, the original story instead of what was turned into Dracula. I'm talking about Vlad the man and his life.
There are a lot of really good documentaries out there. I really enjoy the History Channel documentary on Vlad. There's such a great amount of stories out there that that can be told. I wish they would make an actual movie about the real Vlad the Impaler. I don't know that they have enough material without adding. I'm not sure that there's enough known about Vlad to make a full 2.5 hour movie based on his character without adding in that element of romanticism and horror, you know. But I do believe that there should be something out there
Well,
that puts
we
his
spent the last
truth out
20
there.
minutes talking about Vlad, basically.
Yes, and what Bram Stoker put out there, I think, while I love the book, I love the movie, I love the story, it's 90% inaccurate. And what I'm talking about is an actual movie about Vlad himself, this true national treasure to his people. That's what I would like to see. I don't believe there's anything out there that has that I know of.
So, if there's anybody out there in Hollywood who is actually paying attention to this podcast, hint, we want to see this movie.
There's enough out there. Like I said, at some point in time, you have to make it not a documentary. So at some point in time, you got to put that Hollywood spin, that Hollywood twist on a little bit. But on the same hand, I think there's enough information out there to base at least something that's 80% accurate about his life. And really, I think he's an intriguing enough character. I think he's a character that has stood the test of time long enough to have his story told.
Yeah. Because if you really think about it, with a lot of the historical figure movies that there are out there, they made movies on Joan of Arc. They made movies on specific kings throughout history.
Yeah. And I really think that there's enough there. Yeah. There's enough information there. It's just a matter of how do you portray this guy who was so right and so wrong at the same time. I mean, me personally, I would love for them to make a movie that really showed the inner turmoil of a man going through all this and having to be that man.
And for a movie for like that, it has to start out with him as a child losing his father, losing his brother, and that is what basically led up to him being who and what he was.
Yeah. And I think you have to tell the story from different sides. I mean, you have these Transylvania Saxons. They're kind of running the show with all these different princes. But why are there all these different princes? Nobody really talks about why there's so many different claimants to the throne. Nobody ever really discusses how that came to be. If it's because there were so many different ruler changes throughout the history of that area. I mean, that's kind of my personal thought, is that there were so many different rule changes that they kind of got lost in the shuffle. Who was the true ruler?
Mm-hmm.
And who knows if Vlad even was a true ruler? He just made himself to be the true ruler.
Yeah.
But I mean, all these people, honestly, I believe, thought that they were the ones who should be ruling that country in that time, in that place. So I mean, the end of the story is, you're talking about a guy who is a hero to his nation. They still love him today. They still talk about what a great person he was today. It's still, to this day, a rough area of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even just traveling that countryside by horse, there are wolves there are wild animals, there are lots of forests, lots of mountainsides. I believe it would be beautiful. I would love to go there and actually see it all. I mean, just the stories and the history of a country that was so worn torn for so many years. But not only that, but the natural beauty of the landscape and everything. I mean, the whole thing, when you tie the whole package together, who was Vlad? He was a man who did what he had to do to keep what was his and to survive, to live to tell the tale. And at the end, he still died in battle. He just couldn't let the other side win. So, here was this guy who, to his people, are great, to his enemies are horrible, and his deeds in life were able to summon up images in someone's brain over 400 years later to turn him into the monster Dracula that we all know and love today.
And you know what? I just thought of what would be really cool if they did something sort of like what they did with Saving Mr. Banks. When they made a movie about what led up to making the movie Mary Poppins. What if maybe they made one on Stoker and showed the process of what he did and what was going on in his mind to make the Dracula novel.
Yeah. I think that would be really, really a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those places, and it's one of those times, and it's one of those eras in history where things just don't always make sense to us today.
No.
We can't
have been there to understand everything.
And until you know the full story of Vlad, you're never going to understand why he did what he did. You're never going to understand why he was the way he was. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we don't understand Vlad's time.
Right. Wow. I'll tell you what, this has been extremely educational.
And I'm sorry for that if it's not as entertaining as we usually are.
No,
I'm kind of boring.
This is what we need. I mean, we are in search for the truth, and there's a lot of things about Vlad the Impaler that we didn't know about. There's a lot of Dracula as to what led up to that we really didn't know about, and quite possibly didn't know that Dracula could have been under a completely different name.
Someone asked in the chats, did he have a son? As far as I know, there were no living relatives of Vlad II. And thank you, Nick, for your comment on that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, he did not have any children at all. He may have, but if so, I have not been able to find any records of him ever having children. And there's a good chance that the Ottoman Empire erased any records of him ever having children. We're lucky to have what we have of Vlad today.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking, like we said, 544 years of history to get all the way back to the real, and that's just going back to his death. So, it's one of those guys that we have what we have on him. There are things we'll never know about him. There are things we'll never understand about Vlad. And I think that bit of mystery is what really romanticizes Vlad to us today.
Yeah.
We don't know. And that's what makes him interesting.
Yes, it is. Well, Tim, it's been one hell of a show. I'll tell you that. Thank you definitely for being a part of this show and sharing all of this knowledge for us. It's wow.
I tried to keep it fun.
Well, for me, it was fun.
Compared to all the notes I wrote, this was a lot more loose than my dry, boring notes that I was taking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, definitely thank you for being on the show tonight. And
thank you guys for letting me do it.
Yeah, and I guess Scott and I will go into our final thoughts here. So,
all
right. Well, Tim,
have a good night.
Yeah, you have a good night too, Tim.
Yep, you guys out there, everybody have a good night. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it.
Thanks, brother.
You know it, Bob.
Wow.
Pretty crazy, huh?
It is. I mean, so much that I never even knew.
And that's kind of why we brought Tim on.
It is.
Because, I mean, the dude is just so knowledgeable about stuff. So, and when you get a guy like Tim who loves to research and just can retain that information, I mean, like he said, he's been
researching this for 30 years.
Yeah, since he was 12 years old, dude. That's amazing. And when you have somebody who has a passion to do that, dude, I could have sat here and asked 50 million questions tonight, but
yeah,
this dude knows his stuff.
All of you guys who are watching, if you do your research and you do your proper research, this is the stuff you're going to find out.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So Tim just gave us a great example of doing your research and finding out the truth.
Yeah.
So this is what to me he's very inspiring in terms of research, in which I'm going to admit I completely suck at. I cannot research.
I can research, and there's things I love to talk about, and I know Tim went more in depth on Vlad, but I knew about Vlad and some of the atrocities, I guess some of us would say he did, but Tim,
I knew about that too.
He takes it right in.
Yeah. Definitely bring him. Oh yeah, we're definitely going to bring him back in the future. And in fact, Nick, Tim is actually going to be co-host on some of these episodes as well. We already know of at least 2 episodes that he is definitely going to be co-hosting instead of either myself or Scott.
Yep.
So he will definitely be hosting on this show.
Yeah, because we got one coming up, I think, next month, where Tim and I is talking to a gentleman from overseas about. I won't say what, but man, dude, it's going to be a great topic. I can't wait.
Oh yeah, I know. That one is actually in February, I think. I could be mistaken, folks. We are booked up in March, so we got guests every week already lined up. But yeah, I'll tell you what. So much that I never really knew about the connection. I knew that Vlad was used as an inspiration for Dracula, but I never really knew to the extent that he was used. And
Right.
I definitely didn't even know about the misinterpretation about Dracul and Dracula.
Right. Yeah, and that's pretty crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
when you think about Dracula, like Tim was saying, you think vampire, but I loved how he got more in depth of the meaning behind the actual meaning behind it. So
Dragons. I mean,
yeah.
think about that. Okay, so next week we have another exciting episode, and we're going to go back into the paranormal, but not necessarily 100%. It's going to be like maybe 75-25 on that one, where the topic is going to be elementals. And who better to discuss elementals with us than somebody who lives in Ireland? His name is Gary Waters.
Yeah, it's gonna be awesome, dude.
It is Gary Waters from Ireland. So he's going to be staying up real late to be on this show.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are especially looking forward to that. For all of you that joined us tonight, thank you so much for supporting us, supporting us, and yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, we appreciate it so much.
Yes. So on behalf of myself and well, it was Scott, but so thank you everybody for joining us on this show. And if it's paranormal or beyond,
Man, we got to cover.
yes, we do. Have a good night, everybody.